single mom alone on a bench in the rain. Unaware the person next to her is a suffering Mafia boss. The gallery event ended at 9 in the evening, leaving behind $200 in wages, and the dull ache of someone who had stood for 8 straight hours, carrying a weight like stone at the center of her body. I slipped the check into my coat pocket while mentally calculating what part of the coming week that money could cover. Perhaps a few simple meals, a quarter tank of gas, and the prenatal appointment on Thursday. Freelance work had thinned out ever since my belly had grown too round to hide. The clients who once eagerly sought my photographic eye just 6 months ago had fallen strangely silent. They turned away now, avoiding me with the kind of wariness reserved for risks they preferred not to touch. I drove back to my apartment through the rain-soaked streets of downtown Asheville, a place where problems are more often solved with money than with sacrifice or endurance. I had grown used to this particular kind of poverty, the kind that never makes the news, not tragic enough to shock but persistent enough to suffocate. It was the slow-brewing kind of poverty that teaches you to count every coin at the grocery store and rehearse conversations with your landlord about rent delays. My apartment was nothing more than a small rented room in a building that seemed to hold its own secrets. No one asked who lived with whom, and certainly no one questioned why a woman 8 months pregnant lived alone. That anonymity suited me. I had carefully built it like a wall around my life. The prenatal clinic I went to was a public one, where doctors and nurses moved like a conveyor belt, treating pregnancy like a kind of mass production. Ultrasounds were done in rooms that smelled of industrial bleach, and the technician who confirmed the baby's gender didn't ask a single question about the father. I preferred it that way. There were no pictures on the walls of my home. No remnants of a life lived before. No thread someone could pull to unravel. No relationship to examine or explain. My mother, Carol, called twice a week from Cambridge. She was a literature professor, a woman who smelled of old books and ginger tea, and who believed no problem was beyond reach if you were willing to keep asking. She knew I had once been involved with a man, someone not quite ordinary, someone she had warned me about with every instinct of a seasoned academic who had read too many tragedies. I had never told her the full story, never explained how deeply I had loved him, that he had once asked me to leave everything behind and follow him, and how, when I asked him to abandon the darkness he lived in, we both knew we were asking the impossible of each other. I kept my mother at a careful distance, not out of anger but as a form of self-protection. If she knew I was pregnant, she would be at my door without hesitation, bringing her worries, her suggestions, and a maternal love strong enough to shatter every wall of isolation I had so painstakingly built. She would want to help, want to know everything, and I could not bear that. Not yet, not until I knew for certain I could do this on my own, that I could survive on the edges of society without becoming invisible. The work that remained was nothing substantial. A few small event shoots at community centers, local galleries, or fundraisers for nonprofit groups. Nothing that ever made it to a major magazine, but every bit of money was like a brick I used to hold my world upright. I had learned how to choose angles that concealed my growing belly, how to leave shoots early, how to negotiate for remote editing. My professional portfolio was beginning to gather dust, the once sharp pieces dulled by the reality that I had to accept work below my skill level just to stay afloat. That night, I shouldn't have taken the shortcut through the park. After the first trimester, I had trained myself to take the long way around, where there were lights, passing people, and shops still open despite the late hour. But the rain that night was relentless. The forecast had warned of heavy downpours, and the sky did not break its promise. Only 10 minutes after leaving the gallery, the rain had turned my windshield opaque, my visibility nearly gone. I sat behind the wheel, hands resting on it, weighing my options. The road home stretched nearly 4 miles. As I pulled onto the main road, I saw them red and blue lights flashing, blocking the entire intersection. A bad accident. I'd be stuck for hours. My only other option was the shortcut. The path through the park was just 8 minutes on foot if I moved straight and quickly. Rain made everything glisten under the streetlights. Since becoming pregnant, I had become more cautious. Every decision passed through the filter of risk, of protecting a life not yet capable of protecting itself. But fatigue, along with the steady drum of rain on the car roof, wore down my reasoning. I told myself this wasn't recklessness, just a choice between 2 bad options. 8 minutes in the rain seemed better than hours trapped in the car. I grabbed my camera bag, locked the car, and stepped into the park through the north gate, where old paths ran between oaks and the smell of rotting leaves. I didn't know that on a familiar bench, beneath the dripping trees, sat a man who was also alone, also carrying things beyond repair, and that night's rain, in the silence of a sleeping city, would unlock a door I had tried for months to keep closed. Before we continue with the next part of the story, if something in your heart has stirred while listening, we invite you to help us share more stories like this one. Consider subscribing to the channel, giving this video a like, and sharing it with someone who might need a word of comfort, a glimmer of hope, or simply the feeling of being understood. Where are you listening from? Leave us a comment below and let us know your city, your state, or even what time of day it is where you are. It means the world to us to know that this story, which began in a quiet corner of Asheville, has somehow reached your heart, wherever you may be. Thank you for being here with Dear Single Mom. Now let us return to the story, where the rain is still falling and an old stone bench is about to awaken memories long buried in the past. The path through the park was more treacherous than I remembered. Slick layers of decaying leaves clung to the concrete and formed a soft trap beneath my shoes. Streetlights shimmered across scattered pools of water and turned everything into shifting shadows. I walked slowly, my hands reaching out on either side to steady myself the way an animal readies for a fall. The heavy camera bag slung across my shoulder pressed into my hip bone, and with each step I felt the uneven weight of my own body, as if it no longer belonged entirely to me. Cold wind seeped through my coat, slipping between the buttons and settling against my skin with an icy grip. My fingers stiffened, and my thin canvas shoes had been wet far longer than I realized. I did not know why I still carried all my equipment, as if unable to let go of the work, even though I knew I was on an indefinite pause. Maybe in a world where everything was slowly slipping away, I needed something that reminded me I once had skill, once had an identity. The silence of the trees at night quieted my mind but did not bring peace. Numbers circled endlessly in my thoughts. $200 from tonight, the utility bill due at the end of the month, a fraction of gas, another prenatal checkup. I had grown used to living in a state where every coin mattered, where shame no longer existed when using coupons or paying for prenatal vitamins in small installments. No one had ever taught me how to be a mother without a father beside me, without steady work, without any arms around me except my own. But no one had stopped me when I chose to keep the baby. I had made that decision alone, and now I lived with it each day, in every heavy breath, every sharp ache in my back, every sleepless night spent inside worry. Asheville was not a place I chose for its promise to single mothers, but because it was small enough for no one to notice, quiet enough that loneliness did not stand exposed, and distant enough that the past had no easy way of finding me. My apartment measured barely 30 square meters, perched on the second floor of an old building, where the entrance stairway leaned slightly and the motion sensor lights flickered unpredictably. But it was mine. With peeling paint on the walls and a window draped with frayed curtains, it remained the only fortress I had. I moved in during the 9th week of my pregnancy, after leaving Chicago on a night bus, carrying 3 suitcases, a camera bag, and a secret I could not share with anyone. When my stomach was still flat, the emails came regularly with offers to collaborate, invitations for portraits and events, even compliments on my eye for beauty. But when my belly began to show, everything stopped as if people could sense trouble through a screen. A pregnant woman was not considered reliable in the creative world. They feared she might cancel at the last moment, struggle to move around, or worse, bring some undefined legal risk with her. I quietly disappeared from their contact lists. Relationships once warm dwindled into polite well wishes or long stretches of silence. I did not blame them. I understood them, just as I once understood Nicholas, the man who had been my entire world. When I still believed that love could change a person, I thought that if I stayed long enough, if I loved deeply enough, he would want to leave the darkness he lived in. But I had been wrong. He did not want to change, or perhaps he could not, and I could not remain in that world forever, a place where every decision was made through force and the threat of silence. We had held everything and lost everything in a single question. Could you give it up? And he answered by saying nothing. A few weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant, and through my own silence, I left. No messages, no letters, no explanation. I thought I was protecting both myself and the child. I never expected that choice would place us in danger, a danger I could not yet imagine or name. The rain began to fall harder as I reached the familiar curve in the park. My belly tightened with each step, and my legs started to lose their rhythm. All I wanted was to leave this place behind, to sink into warm water, to lie down in bed and soothe the child turning gently inside me. But then I saw the bench, and the man sitting there, his back straight, perfectly still, as if he had been waiting for me since the first drop of rain fell. And that rain, in that moment, settled on my skin like a premonition. At first, I meant to walk past, without looking, just keep moving, let the rain and the darkness erase any trace of me. but the way the light from a distant lamppost fell across his face made me stop. It wasn't immediate recognition. It was instinct first, then memory. His dark hair clung wet to his forehead, his jacket was soaked through, and in his hands, as impossibly out of place as anything could be on a night like this, was a bouquet of red roses. The flowers tilted forward as if they had just been placed there, carefully, slowly, like part of a ritual. I didn't need a voice or a glance to know it was Nicholas. We used to come to the park not to stroll like other couples but to observe. He liked silence, so I would speak. I liked stillness, so he would emerge in the pauses. That bench beneath the old oak tree was where I took the first photo of him. Back then, he sat alone in a dark suit that made no sense in a park, the kind of man separate from life but watching it with startling attention. I took the photo without asking. He turned his head just as I clicked the shutter. Not angry, just a faint smile, the kind that said he already knew the ending to the game I thought I was playing. That was where it began. Now, nearly a year since I had last seen him, we stood in the same frame again, though neither of us was who we had been. I paused for a few seconds, my hand unconsciously gripping the strap of my camera bag. My belly stretched uncomfortably, and my heart fell out of rhythm. I could walk away. I had left him once without a word. I could do it again. But the sound of my footfall on the wet pavement made him lift his head. Our eyes met. In that flicker of time, I saw everything pass through his gaze. Shock, recognition, then something deeper, as if memory were piecing itself together without effort. He stood, the bouquet still in his hand. I didn't move. Only the rain moved, falling with blunt persistence, unkind and indifferent, as if even the sky couldn't decide whether to shelter us or let us go. His eyes dropped to my belly. He looked for a long time, no questions. The roundness beneath my coat was beyond disguise. I no longer walked with the light steps I once had, no longer passed through the world unnoticed. Every movement now testified to something I had hidden. The bouquet trembled slightly in his hand. One petal fell onto the bench, soaked through and curling in on itself like a question without an answer. He said my name. His voice was hoarse, soft, as though he feared the sound alone might shatter the fragile space holding us apart. Lauren. The word left his mouth not as blame, not like someone calling out to a ghost, but like a man who had just found something he thought was lost forever. I couldn't run. The bitter irony of being 8 months pregnant was that I was perfectly suited to disappearing, yet entirely incapable of escape. I took a step back, then stood still. Nicholas didn't move forward either. We both seemed to understand that any motion could cause the whole thing to collapse. He drew a deep breath, as if he had to pull his voice up from the silence that had dried it out. How long have you known? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because if I did, I'd be admitting that I had known before I left, that I had chosen to keep it from him, that I had denied him the chance to be part of this. And I knew that for someone like Nicholas, that truth wouldn't just be a wound. It would be betrayal. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag as I turned to leave. He didn't stop me. He didn't call after me. But as I passed him, his hand rose just enough to brush my elbow. No force, no pull, just the lightest touch, to let me know he was still there, still real, still trying to understand. Don't. He said it softly, barely above the sound of the rain. Don't walk away like we were never anything. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. It was the voice of someone who had once loved, who had once lost, and was now standing in front of something that could no longer be called hope, but hadn't yet hardened into despair. I didn't look back, but my heart turned. In the dark of the park, beneath the rain, I knew with sudden, terrifying clarity everything I had been running from was now standing right in front of me. I stood there, rain slicing cold across my skin, caught between two choices. I could keep walking, pretend I hadn't heard him, or I could turn around and face the man I had tried so hard to erase from my life. Every part of me was torn. My mind told me to go, to remember why I had left, to remember the danger, the quiet threat that had always shadowed him, and that the child growing inside me could not, must not, be pulled back into that world. But my body stayed still, not out of fear, but because somewhere deep inside, I had never fully let him go. Some bonds defy language. They aren't broken by distance. They lie dormant, waiting for a moment, to breathe again. I turned around, slowly, still clutching my camera bag to my chest like a fragile shield. Nicholas remained where he was, unmoving, as if one wrong step would make me vanish once more. The bouquet in his hand was now drenched, the deep red petals sagging under the weight of the rain, Or maybe the sadness they had absorbed. He could have been sitting there for hours. Or maybe he had just arrived. But the only thing I knew for certain was that those flowers were not meant for someone else. "Why this park?" I asked, not loudly, but loud enough to rise above the uneven rhythm of the rain tapping on the pavement. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Because this was the last place you smiled at me." The answer was so simple it hurt. Some memories, no matter how small, lodge themselves deep in the mind like fragments of glass, refusing to dissolve, refusing to be forgotten. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and laid the bouquet down on the bench. He didn't offer it to me directly, didn't extend an apology or a plea. Just a quiet gesture, restrained and still. And I realized that had always been his way. Even when he loved me, he never spoke in sweet words, never sent daily messages, never made promises for the future. But he always appeared when I needed him most, always did something small that only later I would understand had meant everything. He asked only one question: "Is it mine?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't know, but because, in that moment, I wasn't sure if the truth would lead anywhere better. I had lived for months believing that hiding the truth was the only way to protect the child. But when I saw his eyes on mine, not angry, not accusing, only filled with confusion and a weariness that came from somewhere deep, I knew I couldn't lie. "Yes." I said it like an exhale, like a pain finally breaking free from where it had been trapped. "It's yours." He didn't react the way I had, braced myself for. No fury, no shouting about betrayal, no flood of questions about why I had left. He simply dropped to his knees, both hands resting on his thighs, as if the weight of the world had come crashing down in that one breath. The rain kept falling, beating against his back, soaking through his dark jacket, but he didn't move. I stood still, heart pounding wildly, unsure of what it was I was waiting for. Then he looked up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Were you that afraid of me?" I nodded. Simple. Honest. The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It wasn't filled with tension. It was something else, something quieter, a kind of recognition. We both knew the past between us couldn't be rewritten into some happy ending. Nicholas wasn't only a man I had loved. He was also someone who came from a world I had fought to escape. I didn't know if I could trust him or forgive him. But when he rose to his feet and softly asked if I wanted him to walk me home, without touching me, without trying to hold me back, I understood that what was left between us now was a space being filled, slowly, with kindness. And sometimes, a bouquet laid gently in the rain is the softest form of apology. I didn't respond. I just turned and began to walk, hearing his footsteps behind me, not close enough to feel like a threat, not distant enough to feel like abandonment, just far enough, like the way we had once loved each other. Quietly, complicated, never quite with enough words to explain it. We said nothing as we walked the rest of the way out of the park. The rain had settled into a light mist, but the pavement remained cold and slick, and the wind sliced through the thin fabric of my coat, as if testing how much more patience I had left. Nicholas stayed behind me, maintaining that careful space, as though he was relearning how to be near me without taking up my air. I didn't stop. I didn't look back, but I knew he was still there, not by the sound of his steps, but by a presence I had once known intimately, a presence I had once trusted more than words. When we reached the parking lot, I stopped beside the old sedan that had been with me since I left Chicago. Nicholas approached slowly, his eyes on the car, then on me, as if trying to understand why I had chosen to leave him in something so cramped, so fragile. I opened the door and placed my camera bag on the passenger seat but didn't get in right away. He was the first to speak. "You shouldn't go home alone tonight." He didn't say it as a command, didn't impose it. Just a simple sentence, heavy as stone. I looked at him. He was cold, soaked, his eyes darkened with sleeplessness. He didn't look like the powerful man I once knew. Gone were the tailored suits, the untouchable posture. All that remained was a man standing in a damp parking lot, holding a wilted bouquet, and caring for me in a way he clearly didn't know how to show. I hesitated. Home meant returning to the small, cold apartment where I would be left alone with all the questions I had been holding back since the moment I saw him again. But going with Nicholas meant stepping into a space that was neutral. Not safe, not dangerous, just unknown. I tilted my head up, looked at the dark sky now emptied of rain, then spoke slowly. "Just one night." He nodded. "One night. Nothing more." We didn't take my car. His driver was waiting at the end of the street. A tall man with sharp eyes and no visible emotion. Nicholas leaned in, said something quietly, then opened the door for me. The car was luxurious, a jarring contrast to the world I had come to know. The scent of real leather mingled with faint cologne, and the warm air from the vents made me shiver without meaning to. Nicholas didn't ask me anything more. He just sat beside me, hands clasped, eyes forward. I didn't know where we were going, and strangely, I didn't ask. The hotel sat on the edge of the city, tucked behind a row of old buildings. Quiet and unassuming. Nicholas checked in quickly, like a man used to handling things in silence. When we entered the room, he pointed to the large bed, then stepped back. From the closet, he took a blanket and a pillow, then placed them on the long chair by the window. "I'll sleep here." I could tell he was trying to do the right thing, even as his mind must have been circling with 100 unspoken questions. I sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting on my belly as the baby shifted softly inside me. Nicholas turned away, as if afraid the sight might break something inside him. But then he asked, quietly, "Do you go to your appointments?" I nodded. "Every 2 weeks. The doctor says everything's fine." He exhaled, almost like someone being released from a breath held too long. I didn't know what he felt, and I didn't dare ask. The closeness between us now felt like a thin thread stretched between cliffs. One wrong movement, and it would snap. I lay on my side, facing left, the blanket pulled up gently over my belly, eyes fixed on the plain ceiling above. Nicholas remained on the chair, head leaning back against the wall, eyes closed. In the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I saw that his face looked a little older, or maybe just tired. We had once been more intimate than this, had once lain side by side listening to the rain against the windows of his old apartment in Chicago. Now, between us stood an unborn child and miles of memory we still hadn't dared to touch. As I drifted into sleep, the soft patter of rain began again on the rooftop, faint and steady. I didn't think of the past. I didn't dare imagine the future. I thought only of one simple, solid truth, that at least for tonight I wasn't alone. And sometimes, that was enough. I woke to the pale light of morning threading through the curtain slats, cold and thin like mountain fog. My back ached from lying on my side too long, and my legs were numb from a night of tension too heavy to name. Nicholas was still on the chair, but now his head had dropped against the backrest, eyes closed, arms folded across his chest. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair tousled, his face thinner than I remembered. He wasn't truly asleep. I could tell by the rhythm of his breath, steady, but never deep. That old watchfulness in him hadn't gone quiet, not even here. I rose slowly, carefully, each movement dictated by the weight I now carried in front of me. I made my way to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. Pale face, dark circles under tired eyes, but the gaze staring back was steady. This wasn't weakness, this was survival. I washed my face, changed my coat, slipped my phone into my pocket, and stepped back into the room. The moment I touched the doorknob, Nicholas opened his eyes. I wasn't surprised. "I have a prenatal appointment today." I said it plainly, not a request, not a hint of expectation, just a fact that needed stating. He nodded. "I'll take you." I wanted to object, to say I could manage, that I had been managing, but I didn't. Partly because I was too tired for a fight, and partly because, whether I liked it or not, Nicholas was the only person who still had a right to be there. The clinic sat on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown, small but warm, its wear softened by familiarity. Dr. Turner, a woman in her 50s with silver-threaded hair and a calm, steady voice, had been seeing me since my 3rd month. When Nicholas and I walked in, she paused for a moment, eyes flicking between us, but said nothing, just smiled gently and motioned for me to lie back on the ultrasound table. Nicholas stood in the corner, hands clasped behind him, his gaze fixed on the monitor, as if everything he needed to understand about the world lived inside that screen. The cold gel spread across my stomach. The wand moved in slow, practiced circles. Then came the sound of the heartbeat, steady and strong. I had heard it before, but this time, with him standing there, it sounded different. Not just the beat of a new life, but a truth ringing through the room, undeniable and alive. Nicholas stepped closer, eyes locked to the flickering shape on the screen. "It's a girl," Dr. Turner said, her voice as warm as ever. I looked at Nicholas. He didn't move, but his lips pressed into a tight line, and his hand trembled slightly. No one spoke for a long moment. Then he asked just one question. "How long have you known?" I turned my head and looked up at the ceiling. "Since the 5th month." I didn't tell him that I had carried the ultrasound photo in my wallet ever since. I didn't tell him that I had whispered names in the dark, imagined the shape of her face, wondered which of us she would resemble more. I didn't say any of it, because I wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. When the appointment ended, Dr. Turner wiped away the gel, then gently placed her hand on my shoulder and told me everything looked good. I nodded in thanks, stood, and adjusted my coat. Nicholas followed quietly behind me as we left the room. Neither of us spoke as we descended the stairs, but the space between us had grown smaller. At the car, he opened the door for me. I got in without resistance. He didn't start the engine right away, just placed his hands on the wheel and turned to look at me. I didn't know anything. He spoke slowly, and there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of hollow disbelief I had never seen in him before. I didn't know you were pregnant. I didn't know where you went. I didn't know the baby was a girl. I don't even know how much I've missed. I turned my face toward the window, watching the city blur behind a pane of glass. I didn't know if he could be a father, not because he lacked the strength or will, but because the world he lived in had never made room for children. I had seen his face after closed-door meetings, the flicker in his eyes, after dark news passed through his hands. I knew there were places in him I would never reach, but maybe the child could. Maybe. I said only one thing before he turned the key in the ignition. She deserves to know who her father is. He nodded. And I need to know who I am when I stand in front of her. I wasn't sure if Nicholas understood what I meant, but all the way back, he didn't say another word. And for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel like a threat. It felt like something beginning. Quiet, imperfect, but real. The morning after the appointment, I sat alone by the window of my apartment, pale sunlight slipping through the thin curtain, falling in broken patterns across the worn floor. Nicholas was gone. He had left early, with only a note, a single line scribbled on a slip of paper saying he had work to handle and would return if I needed him. I read that note over and over, not for the message, but for the handwriting. Bold strokes, tilted slightly, to the right, like the way he spoke, always holding something back, always in control. I folded it and slipped it into the drawer where I kept things I wasn't sure I should be keeping. I took the ultrasound photo from my wallet and placed it on the table. Just a small blur, but undeniably shaped like someone. Every time I looked at it, my hand instinctively found my belly. She kicked softly, as if in response, a calm movement in the middle of so much chaos. I wondered, if I hadn't seen Nicholas that night in the park, would everything have gone on the same? Would I have kept his existence sealed away from her life? And if one day she grew up and asked me about her father, what would I have said? I used to think I could avoid the question, but not now. Silence had come to its end, and now, everything I did carried weight. Every step forward left a mark. The phone vibrated softly on the table. A message from an unknown number. No name. Just a single line. We know you were in the park in Asheville. A new message appeared before I could process the first. Send us the file of the man on the bench. We know you have it. I had never received a request like that. A familiar tension tightened along my spine. I checked my recent calls and messages, nothing unusual. But the way the messages were written, clean, brief, without a single spelling error, reminded me of clients I had once worked with back in Chicago. Some of them hadn't been typical clients. I opened my external hard drive and pulled up a handful of older photos on the screen. I didn't intend to send any. I just needed to look, to see if something might have been misunderstood or accidentally captured. Among hundreds of still frames, there was one I had never paid much attention to. Taken in the late afternoon at the park, a few weeks before I left. A group of people sitting on a bench. Far in the background, Nicholas, turned away from the camera, only his back visible. But behind him, blurred in, the corner of the frame, was a man looking directly at the lens. His face wasn't sharp, but it was clear enough to know he hadn't just happened to be there. He was watching. I zoomed in, trying to study the shape of his face, the style of his coat, anything I could use to identify him. But the photo had been taken with a wide-angle lens. The detail was soft. I remembered that day. I had only meant to capture the late light. I hadn't planned to photograph anyone. I didn't say anything to Nicholas right away, partly because I wasn't certain, partly because I needed time to check everything again. That evening, when Nicholas returned, carrying a bag of warm food and a calm expression, I still hadn't settled. He placed the bag on the table and asked quietly how I was feeling, if I was tired. I gave him just enough of an answer to ease his concern, then handed him the camera. Do you know this man? My voice was soft but firm. Nicholas looked at the screen, his eyes, narrowing. In seconds, his whole body went still. Not out of surprise, out of recognition. He knew him. I saw it in the smallest change in his face. He shouldn't be here, Nicholas said, his voice low and careful, as if working through a calculation in real time. I sat down, hands clasped together. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. He doesn't work for me, and if he's been following you, this is more serious than I thought. I didn't answer. Just watched him. There was something different in his eyes now. This wasn't the man trying to make amends. This was a man recognizing a real threat, a man preparing to face it. I didn't know who had sent the messages. I didn't know who had noticed that one image buried in hundreds, but I knew one thing. The quiet life I had tried so carefully to hold on to was being pulled into the light. And the world Nicholas came from, it had never truly disappeared. It had only been waiting for a reason to return. And, this time, I was no longer alone. Nicholas didn't leave the apartment after seeing the photo. He closed the windows, drew the curtains, then turned on the low amber lights around the room, as if the softer glow might calm the storm spinning through both our minds. He made a short phone call, speaking in Italian to someone on the other end. His voice low, firm, unwavering. I didn't ask what he said. I didn't need to know the details to understand this had moved beyond ordinary conversation. I stood by the window, looking down at the street below. The lights from passing cars cast shifting shadows on the building across the way. Everything appeared normal. People walked by. Shops remained open. The quiet murmur of daily life rose and fell in the background. But inside my apartment, something had already begun to shift. I was no longer the woman hidden in a small town, waiting in silence for labor to begin. I had once again been pulled back into Nicholas's world, the one I had fled from, the one I thought I had escaped. He came over and sat across from me, his hands clasped. The man in the photo is named Matteo. He used to belong to a rival branch. He vanished over a year ago. No one knew where he went. His appearance in Asheville isn't coincidence, and it has nothing to do with me. I looked at him. He didn't need to say more. His eyes told me what the words left out. If Matteo was watching me, it meant I had been exposed. Not because I had done anything to stand out, but because I was connected to Nicholas. And worse, because my daughter was too. I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't quite fear. It was that crushing sensation that comes when you realize you've been cornered. Every effort I had made to keep things hidden for nearly 8 months could now unravel because of a single photograph, a single glance, or a feud I had never fully understood. Nicholas laid one hand on the table, his voice low. "I'll take care of the rest. You just need to keep her safe." I let out a soft laugh, not with amusement, but with the kind of resignation that carries no weight. Safe. What did that word mean anymore? A worn-out apartment with a loose lock. A car without airbags in the back. A single mother with a child due any day. We had never been safe. I had just lived inside uncertainty for so long. It had begun to feel ordinary. That night, Nicholas stayed. He said nothing more about Matteo, offered no insight into what he planned to do. But I knew. I always knew when he was quiet. It meant everything had already been arranged. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake. My belly ached in a low, dull way, not sharp, just the kind of tightening Dr. Turner had warned me might be early signs. I hadn't told Nicholas. I wasn't ready. My phone vibrated again. Another unknown number. I wasn't going to answer, but my finger pressed the button anyway. A man's voice came through, soft and polite. "Is this Miss Lauren?" I froze, said nothing. The voice continued. "You didn't respond to our text. We are not asking again. We don't want any trouble. Just the original file. No police." I hung up. Cold sweat prickled along my back. Nicholas stepped out from the other room, and when he saw my face, his expression darkened. I handed him the phone. He looked at the number, said nothing, then grabbed his coat and called someone on his side of the world. And just like that, the quiet days were over. All that morning, I sat in the corner of the couch, one hand resting on my belly, my eyes fixed on the screen of my camera. That single photo had become the center of everything. A moment that once seemed accidental had now become the spark of something far bigger than I could control. I thought about my daughter, about the name I hadn't yet dared to speak aloud. I used to think I'd name her Sophie, a name I had loved since I was a child. But I had hesitated, afraid that saying it out loud would mean admitting I was attached. There was no doubt anymore. I was attached, deeply, irreversibly. In the afternoon, Nicholas returned with a suitcase. He set it down on the floor and spoke with a calm voice. "You can't stay here. I had known that for some time. even if no one had said it aloud. He had rented a small house outside the city, with people he trusted watching over it. We would leave that night. No one could know. We would take nothing but what was necessary. I nodded. When every door begins to close, you don't make choices anymore. Only survival remains. And inside me, there was no room for regret. Only one thought held steady. I had to keep Sophie alive, even if it meant going to the ends of the earth. I hadn't thought about my mother in months. Not because I didn't miss her, but because memories of her were like a drawer I'd locked shut, knowing that opening it would bring more than just warmth. It would bring pain, disappointment, things I had never quite forgiven. My mother was the kind of woman people admired. Strong, self-sufficient, sharp-minded, and she was all of those things but also a woman with a heart sealed tight, and a belief that children should grow up on their own. The less they needed their parents, the better off they were. When I left Chicago, I didn't tell her. Not because she would have stopped me, but because I knew she wouldn't hold me, wouldn't make me feel like there was a home to return to. In her world, love often came with conditions, and after all these years, I had learned how to live without that kind of love. But after the night Nicholas told me I had to leave Asheville, after I agreed to walk away from the only place I'd tried to make a home, carrying just one small suitcase and a folded ultrasound photo in my wallet, I found myself thinking of my mother. Not because I needed comfort, but because I realized I no longer had the time to keep the distance between us. I was about to give birth, and, for the first time in my life, I wanted someone I could call family to stand near me when that sacred moment came. Nicholas didn't say much when I mentioned her. He only asked where she lived. I told him she taught literature in Cambridge, lived alone in a 2-story house with a white fence and lavender planted along the path to the front door. He nodded once, then made a call to his people. 2 days later, we arrived in Massachusetts. It was a cold but dry afternoon, the sky unusually clear after weeks of unrelenting rain. Nicholas didn't walk me to the door. He stayed in the car, letting me go alone. I knew he was giving me space, a quiet kind of respect I had never asked for but always appreciated. I rang the bell, a long pause, then the door opened, and she stood there. Her posture still straight, her hair more silver than the last time I saw her, but her eyes sharp, measuring, and still not ready to soften, remained unchanged. I spoke first. I need to talk. No greeting. No tears. She stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The house smelled of old books and ginger tea, the scent of my childhood, of winter nights when she would read Balzac and I would curl beneath a blanket, pretending to sleep just to hear her voice steady and rhythmic like waves. I sat down in the wooden chair by the window. She brewed tea, brought 2 cups, and didn't ask if I wanted any. When I told her I was going to be a mother, she didn't react right away. She took a sip of tea, set the cup down, then asked, "Where is the baby's father?" I said Nicholas's name slowly, letting her feel the weight of it, knowing this was not a simple story. I told her about leaving Chicago, about why I hadn't said anything, about how I had lived, about the photograph, the phone call, the man named Mateo. Her face changed only slightly as I spoke. But when I finished, when I said I was afraid I wouldn't make peace with her in time, that I was afraid the baby would arrive before, I found the courage. She reached into the pocket of her coat and handed me a handkerchief. Not to wipe my tears, but as a sign she was still here. She was listening. Finally, she spoke. "Daughter, being a mother means learning to forgive every day. Forgive your child, forgive others, forgive yourself. I'm not good at expressing things. But if you think you can do this alone, you're wrong. You'll need someone beside you. Not just when you give birth, but in the long nights afterward when you're up because of the crying, when you question everything, when you feel like you're not enough. And if you'll let me, I'd like to be that person." I cried. Not loudly, not with sobs, just quiet tears slipping down my cheeks. My mother didn't hug me, but she placed her hand on my shoulder for the first time in a very long time. When I left the house that day, the sky had begun to rain, soft and steady, but inside me, there was light. I returned to the car. Nicholas looked at me, through the rearview mirror, and didn't ask anything. I simply said, "She's coming." And for the first time, I truly believed I wasn't going forward alone anymore. The drive back from Cambridge to the small house Nicholas had prepared for me passed in silence. My mother sat beside me in the car, fastening her seatbelt with careful precision, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if holding herself steady. I couldn't count the number of times I had imagined the moment she and Nicholas would meet, yet no version had ever left me feeling at ease. They were 2 people shaped by entirely different worlds. One, A man who had lived where loyalty and silence determined everything. The other, a woman who believed all things could be solved through reason and unflinching dialogue. I wasn't sure they'd find common ground beyond me, and the child soon to be born. Nicholas was already waiting on the porch when we arrived. The warm glow of the porch light spilled across his shoulder, casting his silhouette in a way that felt both familiar and guarded. He didn't move when my mother stepped out of the car. They looked at each other for a long second. Not too long, but just enough to measure, to assess. My mother was the first to speak. She nodded slightly and said, "Thank you for protecting my daughter." Nicholas inclined his head, a gesture that was polite, but also held a trace of distance. He didn't reply right away, only stepped back and held the door open for her. I followed behind, noticing immediately how the air inside the house had changed. Everything was in order, warm and quiet, but the silence now had a weight to it. Not the silence of peace, the silence of waiting. We sat at the table. Nicholas had prepared tea and toasted bread. Nothing elaborate, but thoughtful enough for my mother to understand he had made the effort. She poured herself a cup, then looked at him this time more directly. "I don't care what your past is," she said. "We all have parts of ourselves we'd rather not speak about. What I need to know is what you intend to do with my daughter's future, and the baby's." Nicholas looked straight at her. No hesitation. His voice was calm, steady. "I will be with them. Not through promises, through action. I don't expect you to believe me now, but I will prove it." My mother sipped her tea. She didn't nod. She didn't argue. She turned to me, her eyes steady. "Can you trust him?" The question wasn't a challenge. It was a moment for me to choose, to speak for myself. I sat between them, my hand resting instinctively on my belly. I nodded. "I can." She turned back to Nicholas, her gaze softening just slightly. "Then I'll trust in my daughter's choice. But you need to understand this. If you hurt her again, I won't stand by and watch." Nicholas let out a small breath of a laugh, one laced with a quiet acceptance. I think he understood, maybe even appreciated it. My mother and I had never built our relationship on emotion. It had always been shaped by truth. And the truth, in that moment, was that I needed them both in my life. That evening passed with a strange calm. No arguments, no buried suspicions rising to the surface. My mother asked a few practical questions about the new house, the doctor, the expected due date. Nicholas answered plainly, without avoiding anything, but without embellishing either. They didn't talk about values or parenting philosophies, but in the way they listened to each other, I sensed a kind of respect beginning to take shape. When I walked my mother to her car, she paused before getting in. She looked at me for a long moment, then placed her hand gently against my cheek. "You'll do it. Not just become a mother, but hold on to what you believe is worth it. Don't let anyone, not even fear, take that away from you." I didn't respond. I just took her hand in mine and held it for a long time, as if trying to draw all of her strength into myself. After her car pulled away, I turned back toward the house. Nicholas stood waiting under the porch light, hands in his coat pockets, eyes distant. I walked to him and leaned softly into his shoulder. For the first time in many days, the tightness in my chest loosened just a little. Family can begin with pieces that don't quite match. And sometimes, all it takes is a single meeting, the right words spoken at the right time, for old, locked doors to quietly open again. The days after my mother left passed in a rhythm that was quiet, sealed, deliberate. The small house outside the city, once simply peaceful, had become an invisible fortress. Nicholas increased the security, adding more cameras around the perimeter, changing the locks 3 times, and staying in constant contact with the 2 men who rotated shifts outside. I didn't ask questions. I didn't object. But inside, there was a feeling I couldn't name, like something was building, something approaching a storm. Maybe, and no matter how steady I tried to remain, my heart beat faster every time an unfamiliar noise came from the yard. Nicholas came and went with a silence that was heavier than usual. His phone calls were short, his voice quieter, more severe. I didn't know the full shape of what was unfolding, but I knew Mateo was no longer a vague figure lurking in the dark. Once, I walked into his office without knocking and found a map marked with red symbols, black and white photographs spread across the desk. Nicholas didn't scold me. He simply guided me out and locked the door behind us. He didn't want me to see more. We spoke less, not out of anger but out of exhaustion. At times, I felt like a stranger inside my own story. Some nights, I would wake to the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, not because he couldn't sleep, but because he wouldn't allow himself to. Not while I and the child were under his roof. I knew he was building a wall around me, a ring of protection, so tight that I could barely breathe inside it, but I didn't blame him. I only wished we could talk more. One afternoon, as I was folding the tiny baby clothes my mother had sent from Cambridge, I found an unfamiliar envelope tucked at the bottom of the box. No address, no sender. Inside, just a single photograph. It showed me, walking in the park not long ago. But what stole the breath from my lungs was what lay in the blurred background. Nicholas. He wasn't looking at me. He was watching someone else, just outside the frame. His face was tense, one hand slipping into the pocket of his coat. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was alertness, readiness. I brought the photo to him without a word. I simply laid it on the table in front of him. Nicholas stared at it for a long moment before speaking, his voice low. They're sending a message. Not to you. To me. They want me to know you're no longer on the outside. You're my weakness, and they'll strike there. I sat down, slowly, one hand moving instinctively to my belly. The baby kicked, soft and steady, a reminder that I wasn't just afraid for myself. I asked him, almost in a whisper, then when will they make their move? Nicholas looked at me, his eyes cold, metallic. Could be any time. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the bedroom, watching the glow of hallway lights spill under the door. Nicholas paced back and forth, making quiet calls, summoning more men to guard the house. What had once been a home was now a labyrinth, a fortress waiting to be breached. Around midnight, Nicholas's phone rang. He took the call in the kitchen, voice lowered so far I couldn't make out a word. But when he returned to the room, the calm he always wore like armor had slipped from his face. He said it plainly. Someone followed your mother's car. They didn't touch her, just watched. But the message is clear. I stood abruptly, my breath catching in my chest. My mother has nothing to do with this. She doesn't belong to that world. Nicholas pulled me into his arms, holding me tight, as if he could shield me from the storm with the weight of his body alone. He whispered against my ear, I'm taking you away. Tomorrow morning. Somewhere else. Farther. No one will know. I didn't cry. I simply nodded, not because I believed we'd be safe, but because I understood that now. The only choice left was to move forward. Whether we were walking into a trap or through the fire, there was no going back. And if I had to pass through all of it, I would do it with one goal, to protect my child. To give Sophie a path untouched by violence, unmarked by vengeance. Only love and hope, however fragile, still worth guarding with everything I had left. We left the house before dawn. The sun had not yet risen, and a pale mist blanketed the winding road out of the pine woods and damp gray hills. Nicholas drove, eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, while I sat in the back seat, wrapped in the wool scarf my mother had knitted, one hand cradling my belly as if I could somehow shield all three of us from the storm waiting just beyond the edge of silence. We didn't speak during the hour-long drive. Only the wind whispered through the door seams, and the engine hummed steadily through the fog. Our destination was a small house by a lake in northern Vermont, more than 30 minutes from the nearest town. No neighbors, no cell signal, only trees, water, and stillness. Nicholas pulled the car to a stop, turned off the engine, and looked out across the lake for a long moment before turning to me. We'll stay here until things quiet down. I nodded, offering no resistance. I had learned by now that arguments rarely changed anything, but listening sometimes gave you a better path forward. In the kitchen, where the broken glow of a yellow bulb spilled across the worn wooden floor, we sat across from each other. Hot tea, cold air, no outsiders, just two people who had once loved each other, hurt each other, and were now sitting in the quiet space where all the unsaid things lived. I placed my cup down on the table, my voice soft. I need to know how far you're willing to go. Nicholas looked at me steady, unflinching. As far as I need to keep you and the baby safe. I didn't answer right away. My fingers traced the rim of the ceramic cup. You always put safety first, but that's not enough. I need more than that. I need to know that after all this, after the running and the hiding, you'll still be here. Not just as a guard, but as a father. Nicholas exhaled, the kind of breath that sounded like he'd been holding the answer for a long time. I can't promise a life without danger, Lauren, but I can promise this: I won't leave again. I've already missed too much, far too much. I can't let that happen again. I bit my lower lip and looked down at the table. Inside me was a tangle I couldn't unravel. I remembered the last time we parted in Chicago, on a cold autumn night with no goodbye. I remembered the hollowness of realizing the man I loved couldn't choose me if it meant exposing the most vulnerable part of himself. But this time was different. We weren't negotiating a relationship. We were laying the groundwork for a child's future. I asked him, "If she grows up and asks why her father once lived in danger and blood, what will you say?" Nicholas was quiet. For a long time. Then he answered, "I'll tell her that back then, her father didn't understand the value of peace, that there were wrong turns, but also right retreats, and that if he was lucky, he got the chance to begin again not for himself, but for someone who deserved better." I nodded. That was the answer I needed. Not perfect, not polished, but true. We didn't speak after that. We just sat there, watching the still lake through the window pane. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, light and steady. Inside, an unspoken agreement settled between us, not written on paper, but etched in the quiet of our breath, in the steadiness of our gaze. It wasn't a romantic beginning, but it was a real one. In a world that had once fallen apart, we chose each other again not because the love was overwhelming, but because we had finally found the courage to face what once made us run. And for Sophie, we would keep walking forward, slowly, with caution, but this time, never looking back. Snow had fallen for 3 days straight. The wooden house by the lake lay buried beneath a thick, white hush that swallowed every trace of path, of footstep, of presence. Nicholas said it was a good thing, that no one would be able to track us in this weather. But I knew he had never been more alert. He checked the alarm system every few hours, communicated with the guards outside by radio instead of phone. Sometimes I caught him standing motionless at the window for long stretches, eyes fixed on the tree line, hand always resting on the gun at his side. During the day, everything remained still. I read, sewed, repacked the hospital bag, sorted baby clothes again and again whenever restlessness set in. Nicholas never stopped me, but sometimes I saw the worry in his eyes when he noticed how tired I looked after a wave of light contractions. We spoke less, but when we did, he lingered longer beside me than usual, his hand resting gently over my belly, as if needing to feel, over and over again, that the life inside was still safe. That night began with an unnatural silence. The wind had gone completely still, no creak of branches tapping against the roof, no footsteps from the changing guard. The whole world felt as though it had drawn in a long breath and refused to let it out. I woke just before midnight, not to any noise, but to a feeling, a shift in the air, a deep, crawling awareness. I turned and reached beside me. Nicholas wasn't there. My heart quickened, not in panic but in response to something I couldn't name, something that brushed against my spine like cold fingers. I threw on a robe and stepped into the hallway. Nicholas was at the alarm panel. A red light flashed steadily. One of the sensors at the back of the house had been triggered. He turned to me, voice low and steady. "Go back to the room. Lock the door. Don't open it unless I call you." I started to speak, but his eyes silenced me. I nodded, turned back, every step weighted with the thud of my heart. I sat on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped protectively around my belly. Sophie kicked hard, sharp, insistent as if she too could feel the shift in the air. I pulled the hospital bag close, checking the contents again, needing something to do, anything to keep my hands from trembling. Outside, I heard the soft tread of footsteps on the wooden floor, the click of the front lock being sealed, Nicholas's voice low through the radio. He sent the 2 guards to sweep the perimeter, but only minutes later, there was a sharp cry from outside and then silence. I clamped both hands over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The wind returned, suddenly, steadily, not loud, but constant, as if the world itself was trying to mask the threat. Now creeping through its silence, a faint rattling came from one of the back windows. Then stillness. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. In the dark, the red light of the alarm system pulsed against the wall like a silent warning, one that needed no words. 10 minutes later, Nicholas pushed open the bedroom door. He didn't speak, just motioned. "We have to go." I stood, grabbed the hospital bag. He supported me as we moved quickly through the hallway, then out the back door. In the yard, a car engine was already running. The driver was unfamiliar, but his eyes were sharp, his silence complete. Nicholas opened the back door for me, then slid into the front passenger seat. We left the house under the weight of night, the tires slicing through snow, tearing open the hush that had just settled. I turned and looked through the rear window. The lights in the house went out then, a brief flash like a spark. Nicholas saw me glance back. He placed his hand gently over mine. "It's okay. he said. But his voice wasn't like before. It held no calm, only calculation. I didn't press him further. A new kind of fear had taken hold. Not just the fear of danger, but the fear that everything we had only just begun to rebuild might already be unraveling. Every wall, every promise, every fragile hope for a peaceful beginning now hung in the balance. But I kept my hand over my belly, whispering into the silence. I'm here. We keep going, no matter how long or dark the road ahead. We arrived at an old wooden cabin deep in the forest around 3 a.m. The sky was still black, the mist thick across the canopy, every sound carrying with an echo, like it had traveled through time. The driver, his name was Jonah, one of Nicholas's men from back in Milan, scanned the perimeter before opening the doors. Nicholas helped me out of the car, his hand gripping mine tightly all the way to the front steps. The cold air cut through my coat, made me shiver in waves. The cabin was small, single-story, with simple timber walls reinforced from within. In the dim beam of Jonah's flashlight, I could see that the windows had already been sealed with thick wooden planks. Something about the way the place was built told me this wasn't a temporary shelter. It was a stronghold planned, prepared, meant for when everything else had failed. Nicholas didn't rest. As soon as I sat down, he began moving through the cabin, checking each corner, speaking low and quick with Jonah. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I had come to understand that everything Nicholas did now wasn't about paranoia. It was survival. I stared out the window, where the faintest glint of moonlight shimmered on snow. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper of someone, watching, like the enemy no longer wore a face, but had become a presence, constant and shapeless, pressing in from the dark. As dawn began to bleed into the treetops, Nicholas returned with a worn map and spread it across the kitchen table. He marked several points with a black marker. I stepped closer. He looked at me and spoke carefully. Matteo isn't just following us. He's sending a message to the others. That I've gone soft. That what I once controlled is slipping. I've stayed silent too long. And now, he's using that silence as a weapon. I went still. I had always thought Nicholas came from a world of violence, guns, and blood. But now I saw it differently. The real brutality lived in the quiet, the negotiations behind closed doors, the unspoken deals made over drinks, the glances exchanged with the knowledge that hesitation could cost you your life. This war didn't need bullets. It was waged with fear, with whispers. Nicholas turned to me. I have to go. Just once. I can't let him keep playing this game. I have to show them I'm still someone they can't touch without consequences. I froze. My hand curled over my belly. I asked, barely breathing, "And if you don't come back?" He didn't smile. He didn't say everything would be fine. He stepped closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "When you found me in the park, I thought I was already dead in one sense, but now I have something to live for. And for the first time, I have a reason to fight that doesn't involve a weapon." He kissed my forehead before leaving with Jonah. I stood at the window, watching their car disappear into the forest road, the tires carving long trails into the thick snow. I didn't cry. I no longer cried the way I used to. Now, I simply stood in silence, one hand on my belly, silently counting the tiny, steady beats within. That afternoon, the snow began to fall again. I sat in the living room, knitting a small cream-colored hat. Each loop of yarn was a way to keep my heart steady. Out there, Nicholas was walking into a chessboard I couldn't fully see. A battle with no gunfire, yet one that could shift the course of every future. I only knew one thing. Whatever he had to do, however heavy his past was, he had chosen to return. And this time, he was fighting not for reputation, not for power, but for us. For a family not yet formed, but already the reason for everything. I woke in the middle of the night with a dull ache in my lower back. Not sharp, but enough to make me sit up, breathing slowly, my hand resting instinctively on my belly. Sophie kicked gently, not the startled movements from before, but slow shifts, as if she were turning in place. Outside the window, the snow still fell, and moonlight shimmered over the lake, half frozen under the weight of winter. The cabin was utterly quiet. No sound of a car returning, no signal from Nicholas. He had left in the morning, and I'd heard nothing since. I stood, pulled on a wool sweater, and walked to the living room, where the fireplace glowed dimly, nearly out. I knelt, added more wood, and sat watching the flames flicker in the dark. My thoughts came one after another like a rapid river. I thought of my mother, her eyes when we parted, filled with warning and worry. I thought of Nicholas, the way he looked at me when he left, strong but carrying something unspoken. and I thought of myself a woman close to giving birth, alone in a forest cabin, no hospital nearby, no family around, clinging to a thin thread of hope that the man she loved would come back in time. I don't know when I began thinking like a mother. Maybe it was during the first ultrasound, when I heard that tiny heartbeat pulsing across the screen. Or maybe it was when I realized I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore, only afraid I wouldn't be strong enough to be someone's anchor. In becoming a mother, I learned that love is no longer a choice. It becomes a value, can't take back. I had accepted that. Not through grand promises or long-term plans, but through the daily effort of protecting this fragile life growing inside me, even as chaos spun around us. Nicholas returned just as dawn broke. I heard the wheels crunch over the snow, then footsteps outside the door. I didn't rush out. I simply sat in the chair, hands wrapped around a still warm cup of tea, waiting for him to come in. The door opened. He stood there, eyes shadowed but clear, coat dusted in snow, face chilled to the bone, but with a gaze that instantly eased my heart. He didn't speak at first. He came over, sat across from me, and pulled a thick envelope from his coat. He placed it on the table. My name was written on it in his familiar handwriting. He said it was the agreement, part of his assets put in Sophie's name. A small apartment in Boston, an untraceable account. If anything happened to him, I'd have a way to start over. I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised a hand. "This isn't a goodbye," he said. "It's a promise. I'm not leaving. But if life has taught me anything, it's that tomorrow never comes with guarantees." I placed my hand on the envelope, feeling the weight of each decision, every quiet preparation he had made. In that moment, I no longer saw Nicholas as a man from the shadows, but as someone learning how to step into the light, for one reason alone: family. I said, "If one day Sophie asks why we were so afraid, I want her to know we didn't run. That even when everything fell apart, her parents sat together and chose love over revenge, protection over retaliation." Nicholas nodded. The firelight caught the lines of his face, highlighting the scars I once feared, but now found familiar. We sat there for a long time, saying nothing more. Outside, the sky was turning a soft blue. I placed my hand on my belly, feeling our daughter's steady rhythm. One day, she'll understand that becoming a parent isn't something that happens by default. It's a choice, a vow, and we chose to keep each other, to keep her, with everything we had left in this fractured world. The pain came at 3 a.m. This time, it wasn't the dull ache or the gentle tightening I had grown used to over the past few weeks, but a fierce contraction, like a torrent of water surging through my back, forcing me to grab the edge of the bed to keep from collapsing. I called Nicholas's name, not loudly, but enough for him to jolt awake. In the dim light of the bedside lamp, his eyes shifted instantly from sleepy to alert, and in a single second, as he saw me clutching my belly, he understood. No questions. He circled around, slipped his arm behind my back, and his voice, low and steady, said, "All right, breathe. I'm here." We had prepared for this moment days in advance. The hospital bag was packed. The car was always filled with gas. The snow outside had been cleared to leave a wide enough path for us to drive through. But when the moment truly arrived, nothing felt like enough. Every step from the house to the car was a battle. I didn't know if my tears were from pain, fear, or the nameless tremor rising inside me. Nicholas opened the car door, helped me in, then rounded to the driver's side. He said nothing, but the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, so tight that his knuckles stood out, said everything. The nearest hospital was nearly an hour away in the next town. We had called ahead when we first arrived, explained the special circumstances, submitted paperwork, briefed them on everything. But as the car rolled over the snow-covered road, every bump made me bite down so hard I tasted blood. Nicholas glanced at me constantly, driving and speaking in a low, urgent rhythm, reminding me to breathe deep. In the blur of pain, I heard his voice, calm but pressed. "You're not alone. I'm right here. It's going to be all right." We reached the hospital while it was still dark. The staff was waiting, a stretcher already rolled out. I was taken into the delivery room, the sudden brightness blurring my vision. A nurse gripped my hand firmly. She spoke gently. "Inhale, exhale. We're with you." But I was searching for one face amid the sea of white coats. Nicholas stood there, eyes locked on me, fists clenched. When I reached my hand out to him, he moved immediately, without pause, taking my hand and never letting go again. Time in the delivery room is a strange thing. Some seconds stretch into endless hours, while whole minutes vanish in a haze. I don't remember how many times I screamed, How many times I wanted to give up. How many times I thought I couldn't go on. But one thing I remember clearly is this: Nicholas's hand never left mine, not for a single breath. At one point, he leaned in and whispered into my ear, "You're stronger than you think. Sophie needs you. And so do I." And then, as her first cry pierced the room like a clean cut through every ounce of exhaustion, I collapsed into the pillow, tears streaming down my face faster than I could wipe them away. The nurse placed her in my arms a few minutes later. A tiny, wrinkled body, flushed and red, with soft black hair and tightly clenched fists. I stared at her, unable to believe I had carried her safely to the very end. Nicholas stood beside me, his eyes wet, unable to hide it. He bent down, kissed my forehead, then hers. Sophie. The name he had chosen, the one I agreed to without hesitation. A name that sounded like wind, like something pure the world hadn't touched in a long time. After the delivery, I was moved to the recovery room. All the exhaustion came crashing down like waves. Nicholas stayed by my side, never stepping away. When I drifted into sleep, he sat beside me, still holding my hand. When I woke again, daylight had fully broken, the first sunlight after days of snow and storm pouring in through the window. Nicholas held our daughter gently, his eyes fixed on her tiny face like the entire world had settled into the crook of his arm. I whispered, "Nicholas." He turned, eyes rimmed in red. He sat beside me, placed Sophie carefully on my chest, and then spoke, slowly. "I don't know if someone like me deserves to be a father, but if I'm allowed just one promise in this life, it's this: I will spend every breath I have protecting her. And you, no matter what happens." I didn't answer. I just squeezed his hand gently and pressed a kiss to Sophie's forehead. In that moment, there was no past heavy enough to weigh us down, no danger close enough to shake us. There was only a family, born out of chaos, held steady by a love rebuilt from the ground up, and through our tears, I saw the promise we didn't need to write down, because the three of us would live every day to keep it. The day of discharge arrived on a morning touched by rare sunlight, the kind that only appeared after many long weeks buried under snow. I sat by the window, holding Sophie close to my chest, wrapped in the cream-colored blanket my mother had sent from Cambridge. Her eyes were barely open, fluttering beneath the soft glow that warmed her tiny face. The room was quiet, filled only with the sound of her gentle breathing, the distant footsteps of nurses in the corridor, and the unfamiliar weight growing steadily in my chest. We were going home. But what is home, really, when everything familiar has quietly shifted into something unrecognizable? Nicholas stepped in, carrying the baby bag, his coat dusted with a few remaining flakes of snow that had not yet melted. He closed the door behind him carefully, his eyes finding me right away. There was something soft in his gaze. Calm, steady. He didn't look like the man who once walked through shadows, nor the one who had to leave us to guard against invisible threats. He looked like a father, a man who, in that moment, was watching the two most important people in his life as if nothing else beyond that room mattered anymore. We didn't say much. There had already been enough said in recent days, promises whispered through pain, commitments made without needing to be spoken twice. He took Sophie gently from my arms and looked at her for a long while, then said quietly, "I didn't know I could love someone this small." I smiled and leaned my head against his shoulder. Me neither. There were times I didn't think I was strong enough to be a mother, but she changed that for me. Leaving the hospital was simple. The nurses congratulated us. The doctor carefully explained how to care for a newborn in cold weather. Nicholas nodded at every instruction, memorizing it all as if preparing for battle. But I knew. There was no war greater than raising a child with your whole heart. The car pulled slowly out of the parking lot. I sat in the back seat, Sophie cradled against me, her warmth and heartbeat anchoring me to the moment. The road back to the cabin felt twice as long, every stretch bringing back a different memory. The snowy path Nicholas had driven through in the dead of night to get me here. The woods where someone once silently followed our steps. The cold, which no longer pierced me, because now every part of me was focused on the little life resting in my arms. The cabin hadn't changed. It still smelled of wood, still held that quiet warmth, still wore its fragile calm like a disguise built from thick doors and discreet alarms. But when I stepped across the threshold with Sophie, something felt different. Not the furniture, not the walls, the feeling. This place was no longer a hiding place. It had become a home. Nicholas had already laid out a mattress near the fireplace and placed the small crib close beside it. He didn't let me do much, changing diapers, mixing formula, rocking Sophie when she stirred. Sometimes he fumbled, like a man just learning to carry the weight of something so delicate, but his eyes never wavered. Every time Sophie cried out softly, he was there. Every time I was too tired, he let me rest and kept watch beside the crib, whispering things in Italian, a language he rarely used with me, but often spoke to our daughter as if offering her a thread of his past to weave into her future. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Nicholas and I sat on the porch. The wind was light and cold. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was scattered with stars, and the frozen lake in the distance shimmered with silver. I leaned into his shoulder. We sat in silence for a long time before I finally asked, "Do you think we'll get to live like this for long?" He didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky and said softly, "I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but if you keep choosing me, if she keeps smiling when she sees me, then no matter how the world turns, I'll find a way to keep this peace." I didn't need any more promises, because I understood now that peace doesn't mean the absence of storms. It means having someone who will stand beside you through every storm that comes. And that night, when Sophie stirred gently in her crib, I knew she had chosen the right place to begin her life. In the arms of two imperfect people, still learning to love, still learning to hold on, with all that they had left. On an early spring afternoon, when the snow had melted completely and tender grass had begun to reclaim the paths near the cabin, I carried Sophie down to the edge of the lake. The water was still, reflecting the new leaves. I sat on a large, smooth rock warmed by the sun, a place that felt 1,000 miles away from the life I once knew. I thought, for a moment, of the old stone bench in Asheville, the place where everything had broken and been remade. But this place, this was home. Sophie slept peacefully in my arms. Her gentle, steady breaths like a lullaby whispered into the rush of everyday life. Nicholas hadn't come with us that day. He had chosen to stay behind, repairing the cabin roof and planting a few rows of vegetables along the porch, his quiet way of preparing for the peace we both hoped was coming. As for me, I needed to return to where it all started, not to relive the past, but to face it with eyes that now understood what a miracle truly looked like. I was no longer the woman curled up in the rain that day, empty-handed and alone. I was a mother, a keeper of hope, a shelter for a child born under the most unexpected circumstances, someone who had once been lost, now certain of where she belonged. I looked around the park. A few children ran laughing across the grass. An older couple fed each other spoonfuls of ice cream, and from a far bench came the soft strumming of a young man's guitar. Life, unchanged in its rhythm, still flowed forward gentle and fierce all at once. But what moved me most was when a woman, likely in her middle years, passed by, caught sight of me with the baby in my arms, and smiled. No words were exchanged, but her gaze held something like recognition. Perhaps she, too, had lived through something unspoken, or perhaps it was simply the silent bond shared among women who have walked through fear and come out the other side holding love. I placed a single white rose at the base of the bench, not for anyone, not in memory of anything, but as a quiet way to close the circle. This was the place where I had once felt the deepest kind of loss, but it was also where I met the man who chose to come back, who chose to rebuild everything because something greater than himself had called him to it. And now, beside me, was the living proof of all of that. Sophie stirred slightly, her tiny lips parting into what might have been a dream smile. I leaned down, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Thank you for coming." Today's story, perhaps, is a gentle reminder to all of us that sometimes life doesn't allow us to begin from the easiest place, but it always gives us the chance to begin again, to make things right, to love more deeply if we're brave enough to believe in goodness. Becoming a parent has never been easy, especially if your starting point is loss or pain, but in that very journey, you may find the strongest and most tender version of yourself. And if you're watching this video, whether you're a single mother, someone still caught in difficult choices, or simply a person in need of a little hope, please remember, you are not alone. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel. Like and share it, so we can continue to bring you more of these heartfelt, human, and intimate stories every day. We would love to hear from you. What did this story stir in you? Have you ever lived through a moment like this? Leave a comment below and tell us the story that lives quietly inside your heart. We will read and cherish every word. Thank you for staying with us through to the end of this video. We wish you and your loved ones good health, joyful days, and a life full of peace and love. Goodbye for now, and see you in the next story.